The wind howled outside like a beast in agony, rattling the old wooden cabin. Thick layers of snow covered the ground, swallowing any sign of life. Inside, Ethan sat near the fireplace, rubbing his hands together, trying to fight off the creeping cold. His cabin was deep in the mountains, miles away from the nearest town. He preferred the isolation, until tonight. A sharp scratching noise cut through the wind, coming from the door. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the wind. Someone or something was outside. Ethan grabbed the old hunting rifle from the wall, his fingers tightening around the cold metal. Slowly, he walked to the door, listening. The scratching came again, weak, desperate. He hesitated. No one would be up here in this storm. His mind raced. A lost traveler? A wolf? Or worse, something he couldn't explain. Taking a deep breath, he unlocked the door and pulled it open slightly. A gust of icy wind rushed in, stinging his face. And there, barely standing, was a massive bear. Its fur was covered in frost, its breath shallow. But what made Ethan freeze wasn't just the bear, it was what stood beside it. Two tiny cubs, shivering, their small bodies pressed against their mother's legs. Ethan's grip on the rifle loosened. This wasn't an attack. This was something else. The bear's dark eyes met his, filled with something Ethan had never seen in a wild animal before. Fear, pleading, desperation. The storm howled louder, and the cubs whimpered, their small cries barely audible against the wind. Ethan clenched his jaw. This was insane. Letting a bear inside? No way. But if he didn't, they wouldn't survive the night. The bear let out a weak grunt, its massive body swaying. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. He had seconds to decide. He glanced at the gun, then at the bear, then at the freezing cubs, and then, before he could even think, his hands moved. He opened the door wider. Ethan stepped back as the bear staggered forward, her massive frame nearly blocking the doorway. His instincts screamed at him to shut the door, to grab the rifle, to do something, but he just stood there, frozen, as the animal moved past him. The cubs hesitated at the threshold, their tiny bodies trembling. One of them let out a weak, pitiful cry, its breath visible in the freezing air. The mother bear gave a soft grunt, barely able to keep herself upright. Ethan felt his pulse hammering in his skull. "What the hell am I doing?" he muttered under his breath. The storm outside was merciless, snow swirling like a living thing, ready to swallow anything that remained in its grasp. Ethan shut the door quickly, sealing out the icy wind. The sudden silence inside the cabin was deafening. The bear collapsed near the fireplace, her breath ragged. Her thick fur was coated with ice, and up close Ethan could see the signs of exhaustion, her ribs slightly visible beneath the layers of matted hair. The cubs scurried to her side, pressing their small bodies against her, trying to absorb any warmth left in her fading strength. Ethan swallowed hard. This was insane. A fully grown wild bear was inside his cabin, and yet it wasn't attacking. It was seeking shelter. "All right," he said, exhaling slowly. "Let's not get any funny ideas, okay?" The bear barely reacted. She blinked sluggishly, her breaths shallow. The cubs whimpered. Ethan had spent enough time in the mountains to know what this meant. Hypothermia. The mother bear was dying. His mind raced. He had no experience taking care of wild animals, let alone a bear. But he knew one thing. If he didn't do something soon, she wouldn't last the night. He grabbed an old blanket from the wooden chest near the fireplace and hesitated. Did bears even need blankets? He shook his head. Better than nothing. Slowly, carefully, he moved toward her. The cubs let out tiny growls. Their baby teeth bared, but they were too weak to be threatening. The mother bear barely reacted. "I'm not gonna hurt her," Ethan murmured, as if they understood. "Just trying to help." He draped the blanket over the mother bear's massive body, tucking it around her as best as he could. He had no idea if it would actually do anything, but the alternative, doing nothing, felt worse. Then another problem hit him. Food. Bears hibernated in winter. They didn't normally wander into storms like this unless something was very, very wrong. If she was out here with her cubs, starving and freezing, it meant something had forced them out of their den. Ethan moved to his kitchen, opening cabinets, searching for anything that wasn't human food. He had some raw fish, leftovers from his last trip to the river. But would she even eat in this state? "Here goes nothing," he muttered, placing the fish on an old metal tray and sliding it closer to the bear. At first there was no reaction. The cubs sniffed the air, their tiny noses twitching. Then one of them stumbled forward and took a hesitant bite. The second followed. But the mother bear barely moved. Ethan frowned. "She's too weak." "Come on, big girl," he said softly. "You gotta eat something." No response. He felt an unexpected pang of concern. Why did he care? This was just an animal, a wild beast. If it were healthy, it wouldn't think twice before tearing him apart. But now, seeing it like this, so vulnerable, so desperate, something in him shifted. Ethan crouched down, keeping a safe distance. The cubs were eating hungrily, their small mouths tearing into the fish, but the mother didn't even acknowledge the food. Then, something strange happened. The mother bear's eyes fluttered open, and for a brief second, Ethan could have sworn she was looking directly at him. Not just looking, staring. There was something in her gaze, something unbear-like. Gratitude? Something deeper. Recognition. Ethan felt a chill crawl down his spine. That didn't make sense. He had seen bears before, dozens of them in the wild. Some from a distance, others close enough to feel their presence. But never like this, never inside his home, staring at him like they knew something he didn't. His fingers twitched toward the rifle leaning against the wall. Instinct, habit. But he didn't reach for it. Not yet. Instead, he reached for a small pot, filling it with warm water from the kettle over the fire. He had no idea if a bear would drink warm water, but he had to try. He slid the pot closer. The bear's nose twitched. Ethan held his breath. The cubs sniffed it first, hesitating. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the mother bear moved. Slowly, painfully, she lowered her massive head and lapped at the water. Ethan exhaled, realizing he had been holding his breath. It wasn't much, but it was something. He leaned back against the wall, watching the fire flicker across the room. The storm still raged outside, howling against the cabin walls. But inside, there was a different kind of silence. A strange, fragile truce. For now, Ethan didn't sleep that night. How could he? A full-grown bear and her 2 cubs were inside his cabin, and he had no idea what would happen when the morning came. The storm outside was still brutal, slamming against the wooden walls like an angry beast. The wind howled through the cracks, but inside, it was eerily quiet. The bear lay near the fire, the blanket still draped over her massive body. The cubs were curled up beside her, their tiny forms rising and falling with each breath. Ethan sat in his chair, eyes locked on the bear. He kept the rifle within reach, not because he wanted to use it, but because he knew that wild animals were unpredictable. No matter how weak she seemed now, if she recovered, her instincts might take over. His fingers drummed against the wooden table. His thoughts raced. Why was she out here? A mother bear didn't just leave her den in the middle of winter, not unless something had forced her out. Was she attacked? Were hunters involved? Or was something else out there, something worse than the storm? He glanced at the cubs. They were so small, so helpless. If their mother died, they wouldn't survive on their own. Ethan exhaled. What the hell am I supposed to do? He got up, stretching his stiff legs. His body ached from sitting so long, his muscles tense with exhaustion. Moving cautiously, he approached the mother bear again. Her breathing was still labored, but at least she was breathing. The blanket had started slipping off, so he carefully adjusted it, tucking it around her massive frame. Her ear twitched. Ethan froze. Slowly, her eyes opened, and again that strange stare. She wasn't just looking at him, she was studying him. A shiver ran down his spine. This wasn't normal. Wild animals didn't do this. Ethan took a step back, keeping his voice low. "Just trying to help, big girl." She didn't move, didn't growl, didn't bare her teeth, just watched. Then, as if satisfied, she closed her eyes again. Ethan exhaled. What the hell is going on? He moved back to the table, rubbing his temples. He needed rest, even if just for a little while. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the room. His eyes grew heavy. Maybe just a few minutes. Ethan jolted awake, his heart slamming against his ribs. The noise had come from outside. The bear's ears perked up, her eyes snapping open. The cubs whimpered, huddling closer to their mother. Ethan grabbed the rifle and moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see through the frost-covered glass. His breath caught in his throat. Tracks, fresh ones, not from the bear. Someone, or something, was out there. He gritted his teeth. Was it a hunter, a lost traveler, or something worse? He pressed his forehead against the glass, trying to make out any movement in the storm. Nothing. Just snow and darkness. Then, another crash. This time, it came from the side of the cabin. Something was moving. Ethan's grip tightened on the rifle. His pulse pounded in his ears. He turned back toward the bear. Her body was tense now, her muscles coiled like a spring. She heard it too. The cubs whimpered louder. "Shh," Ethan whispered. "Stay quiet." The bear let out a low, rumbling growl, not aggressive but warning. Ethan's stomach twisted. If she was reacting like this, then whatever was out there wasn't good. He took slow steps toward the door, gun raised. His mind raced. What if it's just the wind? What if it's nothing? But deep down, he knew better. The storm had been raging all night. Why would there suddenly be fresh tracks now? His fingers hovered over the doorknob. A voice in his head screamed, "Don't open it." But he had to know. He unlocked the door and pulled it open just an inch. Snow blasted in, stinging his face. The wind howled, almost drowning out the sound of movement, but he heard it. Breathing, heavy, slow, deliberate. A dark shape loomed just beyond the edge of the cabin. Too big to be human, too silent to be a normal bear. Ethan's blood turned to ice. Then, in the blink of an eye, it moved. A blur of black, lunging toward the door. Ethan barely had time to react. He threw his weight against the door, slamming it shut just as something massive collided against it. Thud! The force rattled the entire cabin. The cubs screeched. The mother bear let out a deep, guttural snarl, forcing herself up on shaky legs. Ethan stumbled back, chest heaving. What the hell was that? The scratching started again, deep, heavy claws dragging across the wood. His mind screamed bear, but something was wrong. Why would a bear attack a cabin like this? Unless... His eyes flicked to the mother bear, unless it wasn't a normal bear. She was staring at the door now, her body tense, lips pulled back in a silent snarl. Ethan's stomach dropped. Whatever was out there, she knew what it was, and she was afraid of it. The scratching stopped, silence. Then a deep, rumbling growl. Not from inside the cabin, from outside, low, menacing. And then the voice. Barely a whisper, but Ethan heard it. "Let me in." His breath hitched. That wasn't possible. That wasn't real. But he heard it. And so did the bear. Because she turned toward him then, her dark eyes locked onto his. And for the first time since she entered his cabin, she looked just as terrified as he was. Ethan's skin prickled as the words echoed in his head. "Let me in." The wind howled outside. But that voice, it hadn't been the wind. It had been something else. Something impossible. His breath came fast, his grip tightening around the rifle. He turned toward the bear. She was still watching him, her dark eyes filled with something he hadn't seen before. Fear. Real fear. The cubs whimpered, huddling against their mother. The fire crackled weakly, its warmth suddenly feeling fragile. Ethan swallowed hard. His rational mind screamed at him. It's the storm. It's your imagination. No one's out there. But another part of him, the part that had lived in these mountains for years, that had learned to listen to the things people ignored, knew better. Something was outside, and it wasn't leaving. The silence stretched, heavy and unnatural. The scratching on the door had stopped, but Ethan knew it was still there, watching, waiting. The mother bear shifted slightly, trying to stand, but her body was still weak. She growled low and deep, the sound rumbling through the small cabin. Ethan had never heard a bear make that kind of sound before. It wasn't a warning, it was something else. A plea. Don't open the door. Ethan took a shaky breath and stepped closer to the door, rifle raised. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, from uncertainty. He had faced dangerous things before. Wolves, mountain lions, even another bear once, but nothing like this. He pressed his ear against the wood, barely breathing. Silence. Then, knock, knock. Ethan jerked back so fast he almost dropped the rifle. That wasn't possible. Animals didn't knock. His heart pounded against his ribs. Was it a person? Had someone actually made it up here in the storm? But then, why had the bear reacted like that? Another knock, louder this time. Ethan's throat went dry. Every instinct screamed at him to ignore it, to pretend he hadn't heard it. But his body betrayed him. His feet moved on their own, slowly inching toward the door. A soft voice drifted through the wood. I know you're in there. Ethan's breath hitched. It was calm, too human. He glanced back at the bear. Her muscles were tense now, her breathing shallow. The cubs pressed against her, their small bodies shivering. Ethan turned back to the door. His mind was at war with itself. A person. It has to be a person. But why would a person be out here in a storm like this? His fingers brushed the lock. Just one turn, and he could open it, see for himself. The fire flickered behind him. The bear let out another soft, warning growl. Ethan hesitated. Then the voice changed. Let me in, Ethan. His blood ran cold. The rifle almost slipped from his grasp. No one knew his name out here. The storm raged outside, but Ethan couldn't hear it anymore. All he could hear was the pounding in his chest, the sound of his own ragged breathing. He took a step back. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human. And then the doorknob turned. Ethan reacted instantly, slamming his weight against the door, locking it back into place. The force of the impact sent a sharp pain through his shoulder, but he didn't care. A long, low exhale came from the other side. The voice had lost its calmness now. Ethan. It said his name again, but this time it was different, twisted. Wrong. Something heavy pressed against the door, not a fist, not a hand, something bigger. The wood creaked under the pressure. Ethan's mind raced. What the hell do I do? The mother bear shifted behind him. He turned in time to see her struggling to stand. She swayed, weak, but she forced herself up. Her eyes locked onto the door. She knew what was outside. Ethan's hands tightened around the rifle. He took another step back. If that door gave way, he'd have one shot, one chance. But then, everything stopped. The pressure against the door vanished. The storm outside seemed to die down. The world fell into absolute silence. Ethan barely dared to breathe. Seconds passed, nothing. He waited, and then the voice whispered one last thing. You made a mistake. A sharp chill ran down Ethan's spine. Then, footsteps. Heavy, slow footsteps, fading into the storm. Ethan stayed frozen, his muscles locked, his mind barely processing what had just happened. He didn't move, he didn't speak, neither did the bear. She just stood there, her breathing heavy, her body tense. The fire crackled behind them, the only sound in the room. Ethan slowly turned toward her. The bear's eyes met his. They both knew it. Whatever had been out there, it wasn't gone. Not really. And it would be back. Ethan didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He sat near the fire, gripping his rifle, his eyes fixed on the door. The mother bear stayed close to her cubs, her body still weak but alert. Outside, the storm raged on, but whatever had been there was gone. For now. His mind kept replaying the words. You made a mistake. What mistake? Was it bringing the bear inside? Was it not opening the door? Or was it something much worse, something he didn't even understand? The hours crawled by. The fire dimmed, and the shadows in the cabin stretched across the walls. Every sound, every creak of wood, sent a fresh wave of tension through his body. But the knocking never returned. By morning, the storm had passed. The sky was a pale, frozen blue, and the forest outside was buried in fresh snow. The world looked peaceful, too peaceful. Ethan exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air. He turned to the bear. She was watching him again. This time, something in her eyes was different. Gratitude. He hesitated, then moved toward the door. His boots crunched against the wooden floor as he unlatched the lock and pulled it open, just enough to look outside. The snow was undisturbed. No tracks, no sign that anything had been there at all, as if it had never happened. A shiver ran down his spine. He turned back to the bear. She had already started moving, slowly, painfully. The cubs stayed close to her as she made her way toward the open door. Ethan stepped aside, watching as she paused at the threshold. For a moment, she just stood there. Then she looked back at him. And Ethan swore he saw something in her eyes, a warning. Then she stepped into the snow, her cubs following close behind. He watched them disappear into the trees, their dark shapes fading against the endless white. A heavy silence settled over the cabin. Ethan closed the door, locked it, and exhaled. His hands were still shaking. His mind screamed at him to forget what happened, but he knew he never would, because deep down he understood something now, something he hadn't before. There are things in the wild that don't belong in stories, things that watch, things that wait, and sometimes, if you're not careful, they knock. Moral of the story. Nature is mysterious and powerful, and there are forces in the world we may never fully understand. Sometimes kindness can save a life, as Ethan's compassion saved the bear and her cubs. But at the same time, there are lines that should never be crossed. Curiosity and fear often lead humans into dangerous places, and some doors, both literal and metaphorical, are better left closed.